Good afternoon, and welcome to today's program, Is Police Reform Possible? Police Commissioner Perspectives. I'm Leah Anderson, the Executive Director of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Padilla Program at the University of Pennsylvania. SNF Padilla serves as a hub for civic dialogue in undergraduate education at Penn, where we facilitate opportunities for students to develop the knowledge, skills, and ethical frameworks to be informed, engaged, and effective community members and leaders in society. Today's program is sponsored by an initiative of the SNF Padilla program, the Red and Blue Exchange. The Red and Blue Exchange promotes viewpoint diversity and civil dialogue, especially across ideological differences. We hope that today's conversation with seasoned police commissioners will contribute to the already robust dialogue about police reform that is ongoing on Penn's campus in Philadelphia and across the United States. We invite you to engage with the perspectives offered by our speakers, either in the Q&A or afterward in conversation with friends, family, and neighbors. Members of the Penn community, students, staff, faculty, and alumni are invited to join a post-event dialogue hosted by the Penn student organization Table Talk. You'll see a registration link posted in the chat, and you feel free to register for this event anytime up until it begins at 6:30. We're very grateful for the partnership of our co-sponsors today. This includes the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School, and two Philadelphia area organizations, the Committee of 70 and the Sunday Breakfast Club. Generous funding from the Gamba family makes this event possible. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for the afternoon, Mr. Dave Davies. Mr. Davies is known to many of you as a regular contributor to NPR's popular Fresh Air program. He's also had a distinguished career as a journalist in Philadelphia, serving in many roles, including City Hall Bureau Chief and Senior Political Writer with KYW News Radio, The Daily News, and WHYY Public Media. Mr. Davies, I hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Leah. Leah, it took me a minute to get my video unmuted. Welcome, everyone. Terrific to have you. We have two veteran police commanders here with a lot of experience trying to bring change to their departments. I'll briefly introduce them. Michael Harrison grew up in New Orleans and rose in the ranks of the police department there. He was superintendent in New Orleans for 5 years before coming to Baltimore in March of last year, where Commissioner, you are keeping my daughter safe. She lives in Mount Vernon, and I'm counting on you to do a great job there. It's interesting that Michael Harrison, both of these two departments that he headed dealt with problems that were the subjects of court-ordered consent decrees, something we'll talk about as we move through this. Charles Ramsey started as a beat cop in Chicago and rose through the ranks, became eventually chief of the police department in Washington, D.C. for 9 years, and then was police commissioner in Philadelphia from 2008 to 2015. He's also a national figure in police policy discussions. He served as co-chair of President Obama's task force on 21st century police. And Chief Ramsey, Commissioner Harrison, welcome. Great to have you both here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And to our audience, I'm going to speak with the chiefs for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to take some of your questions, so you can look at the question and answer function on your screen. Maybe wait a bit till we get into the conversation a bit, and then submit your questions. We will get to as many as we can before wrapping up. I want to begin by just talking a little bit about the personal experience of our two commissioners, because, you know, it's clear from in the protests we've seen this year and for many years that there's a perception among African Americans, particularly African American men, that they are profiled and targeted by police for harassment or sometimes abuse. You both grew up as African American kids in American cities, and let me start with you, Commissioner Harrison. Did you or your friends, when you were a teenager, feel profiled or targeted by the police?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us for this important discussion. Growing up in New Orleans, I had been stopped by police, but I never felt like I had been profiled. My experiences were never really bad. I was never arrested. I was stopped and checked out from time to time. The neighborhood I lived in was not the greatest of neighborhoods, and so from time to time, over the course of growing up, it's not a lot, but there were a few times that I was stopped. I never felt like I was being harassed or I was being profiled. I probably would tell you that I didn't even know what profile was during those years or what harassment really was during those times. And I didn't have any friends in my community who were complaining about that at that time either. Right out of high school, I joined the military and National Guard, and then later at 21 joined the police department. So very early on, I had a very military and paramilitary structure in my life. The son of two school teachers, and my father was a high school principal. So discipline and structure and respect for authority was really big in my family and in my home.
Okay, Chief Ramsey, what was your experience as a kid?
Well, I was fortunate. I mean, I got stopped by police once that I can recall, and it was a speeding ticket. And I confess I was in fact speeding. But I was lucky. I mean, I grew up on the south side of Chicago in a pretty tough neighborhood, Inglewood, which unfortunately today is known to be one of the more challenged communities in the country, actually. But I was very fortunate. But my parents did a very good job of keeping us active and keeping us off the streets, my brother and I, my sister. I can appreciate it more now that I'm an adult than I ever did as a child. But we grew up in an area that had a lot of gang activity. In fact, I saw my first murder when I was 14 years old, when my brother's best friend was murdered for not joining a gang right outside of my house. So, I was very lucky. But even having said that, I know that profiling does happen. So I don't want to give anybody the impression that somehow, denying the fact that there aren't issues there. I'm just fortunate enough not to have been one of them during my childhood.
So you and your friends didn't view police as the enemy. They viewed them as people who served in the main?
No, we didn't think about police at all, to be honest with you. I mean, my buddies and I mean, we really didn't. I mean, the one cop I knew was a school police officer. And I mean, he was a nice guy. I mean, we didn't have much interaction with him. But I didn't see him in a negative light at all. But again, I know that's not the experience that many growing up in my neighborhood had.
Okay, now, both of you spent a long time as police officers before you reached senior command positions.
Right.
You'd worked your way up. Commissioner Harrison, when you were a cop for all those years, did you see targeting and racial discrimination, do you think, among your fellow officers?
Well, I did. In New Orleans, had its share of issues for many years. And in 2012, when the Department of Justice conducted its investigation into our department, they actually said, and this is a quote, "We were the most troubled department in America." And that's a quote in the DOJ findings, which led us to a federally mandated consent decree. I grew up in that department, and I spent almost 10 years of my 24 years before becoming a chief in the Internal Affairs Division as a sergeant, as a lieutenant, as a commander, investigating those allegations against other members of my department. So while I saw it as an officer performing the work, I actually saw it as an investigator at all ranks investigating those allegations.
Were you resented? Were you resented by a lot of cops?
Well, you don't make friends necessarily when you go to go work in the integrity unit, and you seem to clear out a restaurant really fast when you walk in. The cops are there, but it's rewarding work, and it's work essential to understanding how an organization is supposed to run, which I think prepared me for being the police chief of an organization that was troubled, and then being asked as an insider growing up in that department to take it on and help make those changes and bring it into compliance with that consent decree. And so I have both experiences, being the insider, rising up, becoming the chief, asked to make reform initiatives in a troubled department, and now I'm the outsider in a different department across the country being asked to do the very same thing. So yes, I saw it firsthand as an officer, and I saw it firsthand as an investigator.
Yeah, I've read about your undercover work, some pretty important work that you did there. You know, I want to get to some specifics about police reform, but I think what I'm getting at with this discussion is this perception among a lot of African men. I mean, I think every African man that I know, that I've spoken to in the last 6 months since we've seen these demonstrations, have said, oh yeah, this happened all the time. I was stopped, I was harassed, my friends were. And as you know, there are people out there who are calling for defunding the police. There is an organization in the University of Pennsylvania community called Police Free Penn, which wants the police to have nothing to do with they want the university to have nothing to do with Philadelphia police, and they want to see the Penn police force, which is a fairly significant force, disbanded within 5 years. You know, there's a lot of survey data that shows there are surveys that show African Americans are stopped more frequently by police, are searched more frequently by police, are more likely to be killed in an encounter with police. And I just want to get your perspectives. Let me start with you, Chief Ramsey. How big of a problem is this? Is this a perception problem, or is this a reality that we ought to be really troubled about?
Well, I think it could be a little bit of both. Is there a reality? Yes, I do believe it is. In fact, I know it is. But here's, to keep it in context, I also think you have to look at the environment and the picture in which you're operating. I've worked in some pretty tough districts in my career. The west side of Chicago, the 11th district, which the Sun-Times just had an article just yesterday that one district, which is less than 6 square miles, already has close to 100 murders in that district. It's 99.9% African American. I grew up in a community, Inglewood, again, usually the second highest in Chicago. DC, Southeast section and other sections of DC in the 90s, and of course, Philly has its share of issues. There is a disproportionate amount of crime. There's a disproportionate amount of victimization that also happens in the African-American community. And I think you have to take all those things into account. Now, that's no excuse for any kind of biased policing at all. But I mean, you can't just look at the numbers and not really think about the entire environment in which police operate. And because you're in areas where you have a high degree of crime, you tend to be more hypervigilant. You tend to, be more cautious as a police officer and so forth. But is there profiling? Is there bias? Yeah, I mean, I've seen it. But I also, every time someone is stopped, it doesn't mean that it's based on just race or profiling. There could be other factors as well that need to be taken into consideration.
Well, you certainly dealt with that in the whole discussion about pedestrian stops when you were commissioner here. Commissioner Harrison, just before we leave this subject, there are people who say we should defund the police. And I think what they are saying is we have had decades of demonstrations, of blue ribbon commissions, of civilian review boards, of consent decrees, and still we see these tragic incidences like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Maybe policing simply cannot be reformed. Do you understand this frustration?
I do. And I don't always think it's tied to police can't be reformed, because as Chuck knows, and as I know, and as I think you know, policing can be reformed. It's really, are we best suited to handle every type of incident? For example, we'll give mental illness or homelessness. And those calls that come into a police department, are we best suited to be the primary responder to those kind of calls? And we're doing that because for probably generations and decades, there has been no funding of the entities that should be responding. So police, in the absence of people to respond, and other professionals have been responding. And so we don't take it personal when people say defund. It really just means take from the police and fund something else who's better suited to do it. It's not about us agreeing to that because we probably agree. It is about how, when, and how much. I'll give you a quick example, an analogy of building a stadium. Never do we tear down a stadium before building a new stadium. What we do is we continue playing in the old stadium while we build a new stadium. When the new one's built, we transition out of the old one into the new one, and at some point we can tear the old one down. So it is about how we transition from what we're doing to pass the work off to a better entity who can handle it better or more properly. But it is about how, it is about when, and it is about how much. And then we can figure out, well, is the department as large as it really is now? Does it need to be this large? Do we need to be responding? But to cut the work off now where the problem is manifest at its worst right now, to hand it off to somebody that's not ready to handle it, I think is probably irresponsible.
Okay. Let's talk about some of your own efforts at change within the departments that you have commanded. There's a lot of experience here in this panel. Commissioner Harrison, when you became superintendent in New Orleans in 2014, the department was already in a federal consent decree. Maybe we could just begin by getting a couple of terms set here. Chief Ramsey, why don't you explain, if you will, what is a federal consent decree as a tool for reform?
Well, the Department of Justice, if they come in and they assess a department, and if they find a pattern and practice of misconduct, usually it centers around use of force, primarily, probably some other areas as well. There's a court order that's then issued with several recommendations. Usually it's hundreds of recommendations that would lead toward reform. And then the court actually appoints monitors to come in and actually make sure that the department is moving toward correcting those issues that have been uncovered. So that's essentially a non-lawyer's description of what a consent decree.
Right, often begins with a lawsuit, and then eventually.
Oftentimes it does.
Right.
It's some
Right.
kind of lawsuit, or complaints that are filed somehow. And then when they come in and they look, and especially in the area of use of force, they look for pattern and practice. Was this a one isolated incident, or is this something that's more systemic that we're starting to uncover? And then that's when you start moving toward eventually perhaps having a consent decree issue.
Okay, so let me turn to Commissioner Harrison, because when you came into New Orleans, there was a consent decree in effect because of a scathing Justice Department review of the department. There was cases of officers accused of shooting unarmed civilians at Katrina. There was a pattern of bias, and then you come to New Orleans, to Baltimore, where there's been a consent decree that followed the death of Freddie Gray. Do you find it, a lot of times local officials resent when outsiders tell them what to do. Do you find it helpful to have a federal judge and monitors, looking into what you're doing and giving you feedback?
Well, I find it extremely helpful now in my maturity. I do find it helpful. 10 years ago, I may have answered the question very differently, because your lens is only based on where you sit in the organization. I find it very helpful. As a matter of fact, it's the only reason I accepted the offer to come to Baltimore, because it had a consent decree with a federal judge overseeing it. And so I knew that I would have the cover and support of implementing reform, because the department is being made to and compelled to reform by virtue of being held in contempt, and even having me and or the mayor being imprisoned if we don't. So there's a heavy stick to compel this department to perform, as was the case in New Orleans. But you're right, I'm the outsider here, and it was absolutely necessary for an outsider, in my opinion, many people's opinion, in Baltimore, because of the nuances and all the issues of the past, where I am not tied to any political official, any business person, anybody, where there are no favors owed. I'm just free to do the right thing. I'm free to speak freely about the real issues, and work to bring best practices and make the reforms necessary. And there's no fear of retaliation or retribution, because I'm under a contract and I have the cover of a federal judge. So it's very helpful here. There are some cases where it's probably better for a local. In the case of New Orleans, it was better for a local to take over. And I was tapped to be the police superintendent there. And that worked for that department then. But for this department, it needed something very different.
It's interesting that you use the word cover. You say to everyone, look, folks, we don't have a choice. We have to make changes or there's trouble here. Let's talk about this in some specifics if we can. Chief Ramsey, I'm more familiar with your work in Philadelphia than Washington, but can you pick an example of a change you needed to make and something you learned about it. Once you got underway, what obstacles were there that you might not have anticipated?
Well, I'll use Washington as a good example. In the 1990s, Washington was a pretty dysfunctional city, unfortunately. I'm talking about the city of the District of Columbia itself. The city government, the police department was absolutely no different. We had a long history of hiring, making very bad hires. So we had people in our ranks that should never have been hired as police officers. There was no training that was taking place on a regular basis. So it was really a heavy lift coming in. And one of the areas was certainly in the area of use of force, number of police shootings that we had. And I read those files. And whereas I didn't see anything criminal, but what I saw was police officers, through a lack of training, poor tactics, the way they handled the situation to a point where at the time they fired the gun, they may have been legally justified, but had they taken a different approach, it probably could have been avoided. The guy I brought in with me, Terry Gaynor, is my number two. We put in new policies, we put in training, we did everything. Then we had an officer involved shooting that actually was a justified shooting, but the community was so outraged and fed up. And the Washington Post had run a week-long series and actually won a Pulitzer Prize. They called DC the deadliest police department in the country. And guess what? They probably weren't. They really weren't exaggerating. That's how bad it was. So even though we had made changes, the public and community trust is essential. They didn't trust us really to be able to actually change. I actually sent a letter to Janet Reno, who was the Attorney General at the time. Eric Holder was the number two. He was the DAG. And I sent a letter asking them to come in and take a look at our department and make some recommendations. Now, I'm told I'm the first chief to ever ask DOJ to come in. But, you know, I mean, listen, they were going to other cities with consent decrees. They could have walked to my office because I'm literally about half a mile from Main Justice. But anyway, they came in and they came up with 300 some odd recommendations. We could not have turned that department around had it not been for DOJ coming in and doing that. It gave us the ability to make the changes that we needed to make, get the money that we needed to make in order to make the changes. So my experience was very positive.
Yeah, interesting point there that it took money. I mean, training, equipment, all of that takes money. So kind of argues against defunding, right? Sometimes reform means increasing.
Yeah, I mean,
funding.
People aren't thinking that, I mean, that's a term that's being used, and when you really dig down and talk to people, that's basically, it's not the same thing that they're actually asking.
It means different things different. Let me turn to you, Commissioner Harrison, and give me an example of something that you did either in New Orleans or Baltimore, and the kind of obstacles that you encountered. Yeah.
Well, one of the first things we did was we created, the very first thing I did in New Orleans and one of the very first things I did in Baltimore was create a critical incident release of video. And we were one of the first cities in America to do that in New Orleans. And we're kind of leading the way here in Baltimore as well, where we have a video incident, whether it's body camera or cell phone video, or any type of video that we're in possession of that would show a use of force, a serious use of force, or what we would call some critical incident. And we now have a policy on how and when to release that to the public. Many departments release video, but don't actually have a policy on how and when to do it. And the criteria is set for release or the criteria to not release, whether you use that criteria to make a decision to not release. So those were the first things we did. But of course, we received a lot of pushback from officers, rank and file, and the unions. You know, think about this in 2014 when I first became the chief, and then again here in Baltimore. My very first act was to do that. Well, we got a lot of pushback, but it is exactly what the community needed, and it's exactly how we establish accountability through transparency.
Right.
Because accountability without transparency is not accountability at all. I use the analogy of it's not how well you do a thing, Dave, but rather how many people know you do it well. So accountability without transparency is not accountability at all. Those were the two things I did as my very first act. Policy creation in both departments.
Right. You mentioned the difficulties with the police officers union. I mean, they do have collective bargaining rights. Chief Ramsey, you fired a lot of cops when you came to Philadelphia. I think 260 is a number that sticks in my head. You know, cases where you didn't wait until there was a prosecution necessarily. You felt like the conduct clearly merited dismissal. And in a lot of cases, they, you know, followed a union process, went to arbitration, and were returned to the job. There's of course another side to this, and if we had union chiefs here, they would strongly voice different opinions. But Chief Ramsey, how do you deal with this issue? How do you get around, you know, a strong union that has loyal members, and in a lot of cases, mandatory interest arbitration? That is to say, contracts are not really determined at the bargaining table. There's a state law that provides for when there's an impasse, a 3-member arbitration panel awards a contract, and you have to live with it. Have you figured out a way around this?
Well, first of all, let me say, I'm not anti-union, but I do believe that many police unions have gotten far too powerful. I did, unfortunately, and I don't consider that a badge of honor, have had to terminate quite a few police officers. About 65% or so may get their jobs back through arbitration. And I've had to fire the same person more than once for different offenses. I mean, it's very difficult to get rid of a problem police officer in many cities, and Philadelphia is certainly one of them. We've got to do a better job in terms of negotiating these collective bargaining agreements because, you know, over years, cities have given up a lot of management rights. Arbitrators are able to make these decisions under the cover of darkness. I mean, they need to be making these decisions public. Their names need to be made public when they make these decisions. So they have to stand it up to the public, because who catches the heat? The police chief or the police commissioner? Oh, this guy should have been fired. Oh, he's back. Why is he back? And there are some people that just flat out should not be police officers, period. But the unions have gotten so powerful, and now they can literally buy politicians. They can form political action committees, and they donate to different elected leaders. And the process is, the only word I can come up with is corrupt. It has been corrupted. I'm not anti-union. I believe there's a place for them, but they've really gotten far too powerful.
Mr. Harrison, you want to weigh in here?
Well, I would agree with Chuck, but I have two different perspectives. In New Orleans, Louisiana was a right to work state. So while we had a fraternal order of police and a police association and a Black organization of police, there was no collective bargaining agreement in that city or in that state. And so here it's different, but we were governed by civil service. And while I may have fired quite a few people, there were some who got their jobs back through civil service overturning those decisions. Civil service are either the Court of Appeals. Here in Baltimore, it's a strong union with the collective bargaining agreement. So I've now worked in two different environments where both have awarded officers their jobs back, because it's extremely hard to fire and keep a bad officer fired and out of this profession. And yes, the unions have a lot of power and are able to get connected with people who actually make the laws. And so those laws are made by the legislators in favor of those unions. But I think the stars are aligned. The time is now to undo that and create more accountability and transparency in our organizations, because the public is standing up saying we want something different. And I think our legislators have to and are compelled now to do something different.
Yeah, in Maryland, you have a police officers' Bill of Rights. Is that right? That's established by the
We have that
legislature,
here.
which you are seeking to have repealed. Is that right?
There's a move to have that repealed. But it has to be replaced with something. There's a move to have quite a few changes. I've been advocating for a number of changes that would give me more autonomy and authority to be the executive and to make those executive decisions to remove people when we need to remove them without this long drawn out process. We certainly believe in due process, but we have to manage and lead these organizations the way the citizens expect us to lead them, by way of making those executive decisions in real time when they need to be made.
Let's talk about policing bad cops for a moment. You know, most cases of alleged police abuse are not prosecuted, right? They're really first investigated by the department's internal affairs unit. And of course, that is staffed by commanders and investigators who may very well know the officers accused of wrongdoing and other officers who were witnesses in the case. That's a sticky position for some of these guys to be in. Can cops really police other cops? Chief Ramsey, what's your sense? What's your feeling on this?
I think so, but again, I think trust. It comes back to community trust as well. One of the recommendations when I served as co-chair of President Obama's task force on 21st century policing for officer-involved shootings, we recommended that an outside agency actually conduct the investigation. And it had nothing to do with the department's ability to be able to conduct the investigation. It's just a perception that it's not going to be objective. It's not going to be one that is going to really find any fault if in fact there is fault on the part of the officer. So having a more objective view or investigation take place. And I believe it today. We actually tried to get the Pennsylvania State Police to investigate in Philly, and they declined to do it. But I believe that's the way to go.
Commissioner Harrison, what do you think? I mean, you talked about being inside and outside departments. Does a civilian review board with some teeth make a difference in these cases?
Well, I think civilian insight and civilian oversight absolutely makes a difference and brings about another level of accountability and transparency while members of our department are investigating other members of our department. I absolutely believe that it can be done. I did it for 10 years. And when you're doing that work, you actually see how bad some of our own officers are and how egregious some of the violations are. Now, all of them are not that bad. The majority of them are just minor policy infractions, but there are some, and we actually get to see it. And sometimes the evidence is very overwhelming. Now, it does require strong policies and strong protocols so that internal affairs investigators don't let cases slip through the cracks, and they're fully investigated with the same tenacity as we would investigate a murder investigation. And I think, but with some oversight, that can be accomplished.
You know, one of the things that I've observed, one of the last stories I did when I was still working at a daily newspaper, involved a case of police misconduct where an officer was angry because his son had been in a fender bender with some other kids, and he actually caught up with these kids late at night in a convenience store. And the store surveillance video showed that the officer ran up on these kids, accosted a young woman, a small young woman who was among them, and put his service weapon in her face, pressed it against her so hard it left a mark. She was arrested, accused of assaulting the officer, until the videotape became apparent, it was revealed. And what struck me about this, the officer was eventually disciplined. But there were at least 2 officers who had come by the convenience store and urged the clerk not to give the surveillance tape, to the lawyers for the kids, essentially wanting to cover up what the officer had done. And it does seem to me that in cases where, officers, let's face it, they're loyal to each other. They know what each other go through, and there's a tendency for them to cover for each other. And in cases where an officer lies or misleads investigators until a video emerges or other evidence emerges and shows that they weren't telling the truth, and the officer who was originally the center of it gets disciplined, but the ones who misled or lied to investigators tend not to be disciplined. Isn't that the typical practice? That's got to be troubling, I think.
Well, it's wrong. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, that's absolutely a bad practice. It is absolutely wrong. And what you're defining is what we call the police subculture, where police officers form these bonds with one another because, let's face it, we're together every day. We're with each other. We're in the car for 8, 10, 12 hours. We buy each other lunch. We loan each other money. We pay each other's mortgages. We babysit each other's kids. We're in each other's weddings. So there are loyalties and bonds that form pretty naturally, but the way cops historically pay back that loyalty is by keeping each other's secrets and helping each other on the back end. But that's the culture we're trying to break. Real reform is when we can prevent those bad acts from happening in the very first place. It is absolutely wrong. And that's the culture right now that we're trying to reverse so that officers will speak up and we won't have retaliation against them when they do.
Well, it just seems to me that,
Can I just add one thing here, because
Go ahead, Chief.
important, is you'd be surprised at the number of there's usually anonymous. Most cops will not put their name on it, but they will send a letter when they see misconduct or somebody doing something, and they will send it in for it to be investigated. You'd be surprised at the number of cops that really complain about the actions of another police officer. They will not put their name to it 90% of the time, but they will make it known. Not all, but you'd be surprised at the number of those you get.
It struck me that in cases where a police officer who is a witness to something and is interviewed, and tells a lie about it, it's a discretionary decision for the police department not to discipline that officer for misleading authorities. And it seems to me that if you don't, then police officers are going to be able to do what they want to do, knowing that it's the civilian's word against them and 3 other officers who they can count on to cover for them. That just seems to me like a really big problem.
Well, it is a problem, but filing a false report in many departments is a fireable offense. I mean, you have to take action against those individuals. The Chicago case with Laquan McDonald, for an example, all those cops should have been fired. There's no question in my mind about that, but you have to really, that's another example though of, okay, you fire them and you go to arbitration. Guess what? The odds of them getting back, even though they lied, which in some cases means they can't even testify in court because the district attorney often will put them on a Brady list and won't use them in court. Well, what good are they if they can't even testify in court? So you wind up with cops whose integrity has been challenged to a point where they're pretty much useless. It's not the majority, but it shouldn't even be one in an organization that falls into that category.
So you would use your discretion as chief. I mean, you're not in that role anymore, but anybody who lies, they get disciplinary action.
Yeah, my friend Art Acevedo, who Houston, he has a saying: "You lie, you die." In other words, you lie, that's it. He terminates you. That's it. That's a fireable right on the spot.
That was our policy in New Orleans. That is our policy here in Baltimore. And because once it's been established that you have fabricated a police report or told a lie, especially to undermine an internal investigation, you can no longer perform any duties as a police officer because everything you do can be challenged and you're rendered useless. And so that's been the policy in both departments where I've worked.
I want to talk about alternatives to using deadly force in some circumstances. And there was a tragic case in Philadelphia not long ago in October where a 27-year-old man named Walter Wallace
right.
was having a mental health issue. His family called police. 2 officers showed up. Mr. Wallace was wielding a knife and they shot and killed him. The criticism was that there should have been a mental health response to that call. And it turns out there was a mental health institution a few blocks away that had dealt with them, and they were upset, and they had a crisis team that they weren't integrated. It surprised me. Well, I guess it doesn't surprise me, but I've heard about this issue for years in Philadelphia. And then recently, I think they've added a behavioral health officer to the 911 dispatch process. But this is an example of exactly the kind of thing where people say, we should take some of the money that currently goes to police departments and add other kinds of services. And I'm interested in your view, both of you, whether you can effectively do that. It seems like in this case, it might have made a difference.
It might have, and I don't have a problem with that. In many instances, many departments are now using a co-responder model because there are some incidents where a mental health worker will not go in there if the person is armed with a knife or a gun. They're still going to have police there. And so some agencies are using a co-responder, which means you have a mental health professional and a police officer both respond. But again, you have to have the funding for the mental health personnel. They don't grow on trees. So you have to make sure that they have the training and you have a sufficient number of them to be available at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is when some of these calls actually occur. That with crisis intervention team training that, departments do, having less lethal weaponry, which those officers did not have tasers. They should have had tasers. Those kinds of things, I think, can maybe reduce the number of fatalities and situations. But believe me, there'll be still some cases in which deadly force will be used and, quite frankly, could be justified.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Harrison, you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, I disagree with taking money away from the police to give to someone else to do it, because we're still dealing with that money is set aside usually 90% or 95% or more for salaries of the employees. And in Baltimore and in many cities, there is no entity that is up and running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to cover an entire city that's already built and ready to accept that work. So, I gave you the stadium analogy. It is not yet, it is about when, and it is about how we transition. But to do it right now and take money from police usually means reducing the number of police officers. Now, if data supports that an agency is too large and should be reduced, well, that's something different. But just defunding for the sake of moving money, there's a way to go about doing that and transitioning over time to give that work to the appropriate professionals and decreasing police response or creating co-responder models. But that's a transition period. That's not necessarily a defunding.
Right.
Commissioner Ramsey, we talked earlier about this perception that young African Americans feel, profiled and targeted. And as you know, there was criticism when you were commissioner in Philadelphia of the Stop, Question, Frisk program in high crime areas. And there was a lawsuit in 2010. There was, a consent decree. And after, I guess, 3 or 4 years, in 2015, there was a report which showed that even though there was some progress in the city, that I think 37% of the pedestrian stops were regarded as not constitutional according to the records, and that it produced very, very few weapons. For example, only 2 guns out of 433 stops that were sampled. What's your take on this?
Well,
sounds like supports the idea that people were being profiled.
no, well, first of all, we trained for officers to make stops only with reasonable suspicion, Terry stops, not just stop and frisk for the sake of stop and frisk and profiling and that sort of thing. Oftentimes officers poorly write reports, which becomes a supervisory issue, that if you don't have reasonable suspicion, then that officer again should face some kind of discipline or punishment or something. But if they had it and didn't articulate it, then that report ought to be kicked back so that they can clearly articulate it. But again, gun violence is a huge, huge problem in Philadelphia. I mean, we're going to come close to 500 homicides this year. And it's just a fact. So, police need to always do things in a constitutional way. They should only make a stop if they have reasonable suspicion. But sometimes when people look at numbers and numbers only, they ignore the fact that there's a real problem of gun violence in our city that has to be addressed. The question is really that officers should always act in accordance with the law, but don't act as if, I've heard people say stop and frisk, just like, abolish police. Well, that's crazy to me. That's ridiculous. That's going too far. You need it to be constitutional, but don't think there's not a need on occasions for police officers to make a stop of an individual, provided they have reasonable suspicion.
And certainly gun violence is a growing problem in Philadelphia. But what about the finding that so very few firearms were actually discovered in these stops? Does that say that they weren't good stops, or is in fact is it the threat of being stopped by police that's preventing or discouraging people from carrying their firearms?
Well, I mean, it's a combination of both. But I mean, there are some people that, now they're not afraid to carry because police are less proactive right now than they were before. And so, just the number of guns alone shouldn't be the one measure that's being used. Were the stops based on reasonable suspicion? What was it? Maybe it was about a gun. Maybe it was some other kind of behavior that led to the reasonable suspicion. And the pat down was for the officer's own protection. That's what the frisk is for. It's not automatic. It's not just for trying to find a gun. So you really have to dig into those cases to really find out if there's a real issue there. And I'm not saying that there weren't some stops that were not appropriate in Philadelphia, but I don't know if just looking at the numbers alone can really give you an indication as to how many of those were not legitimate.
I want to get to some audience questions soon, but I want to give, before we do that, I want to give each of you a chance to give me any thoughts that you've been wanting to get in here. And let me ask this question. Is there a national fix here? I mean, there's not a national fix. Obviously, there are thousands of police departments. They all have their own local officials and tax bases that they have to respond to. But are there things that you need from, we're going to have a change in administration in Washington. Are there things that would make a difference nationwide. Mr. Harrison?
Well, I think there is. You know, I've done some work with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, as has Chuck, and I'm now working with the National Police Foundation to produce now the second national report for police reform and recommendations for that reform. There are things we can do by having standards at the national level for use of force, by having a use of force registry at the national level, so that when officers are dismissed or resign under investigation, we can prevent them from taking up employment in other agencies, whether in our state or in any other state. In making sure that training is consistent across all 50 states, because each state has its own training commission, and you'll be surprised how many variations of training certifications there are to deliver training to sheriffs, deputies, and police officers across the 50 states. So there are some things we can do. That report from the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and I believe this Police Foundation report and others and things that Chuck worked on before this, all point to creating some standardization, some coordination at the national level to ensure that police departments of one are performing just like police departments like New York of 36,000. That there's some standards that govern us all and their registries so that we can report and become transparent with what we're doing in our communities.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people are jealous about states' rights, and a lot of people say local control is best. I mean, is there going to be a battle to get the kind of standardization at the national level?
I think that's going to be a challenge, but every state right now is dealing with it. Every chief I talk to around the country is dealing with it. Their state legislators are all taking up issues and proposing bills for the upcoming year's legislation to bring about bills for police reform, and what will that look like in that state. But what we need is some level of standardization across policy, across training, across discipline, and with registries, so that at least we can know what's happening in smaller police departments and large police departments, and we can know that use of force training and the policies are similar, if not the same, according to the national standard.
Chief Ramsey, you spend a lot of time looking at departments across the country. What can be done at the national level?
I agree with Mike. I mean, there are some standards that can be established in terms of certification and decertification, for an example, certain training standards that could be put in place, certain use of force type standards like chokeholds and so forth, banning chokeholds. I mean, so there are some things that can be done. Interoperability of information systems. I mean, we've got FirstNet that's been created, to be the public safety network. Now you've got Verizon is on board with theirs. T-Mobile's got theirs. Guess what? Those three don't talk to one another. So the federal government could pass some standards that make those systems work together. So if there's a true emergency, it's not like 9/11 when you can't talk to one another. But just one final thing, I think that I just want to say, we need to be looking, and I realize today is about police reform, but the entire criminal justice system needs to be assessed. And there's reforms that need to take place throughout the criminal justice system, not just police, because to reform police and not look at the rest of the system, it's not going to get the kind of outcome that people are really looking for.
Right. There are now drug courts, for example, that are trying to, divert people away from prisons into treatment. Is that having an impact? I mean, it seems like a logical thing to do. Yeah.
It certainly can. But I mean, you have to look at everything. I mean, the last time it was a comprehensive look, I believe, is when LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, was president of the United States. I mean, the people in the system today weren't even born when he was president. So, I mean, a lot has changed. And we just need to take a comprehensive look at the entire system because there's bias that exists in our society, and there's bias that exists throughout the criminal justice system, and we need to address it. Okay,
let me get to some audience questions that have been submitted here. One of them was asking about Chief Harrison's program that's, the acronym is EPIC. Commissioner, that's what ethical policing is. Help me. Courageous. Yeah, you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, EPIC is a program we started in New Orleans. We're now bringing it to Baltimore, and it's also evolved now into a national peer intervention program at Georgetown University Law Center called ABLE, Active Bystandership for Law Enforcement. But EPIC is a peer intervention system whereby we teach the concepts of active bystandership to police officers to help de-escalate each other's behavior, much like we were taught to de-escalate citizen behavior. More than just de-escalation, to intervene on behalf of another police officer. Hear this, Dave, even a police officer of a higher rank. And so we teach and we taught there in the early years when I was in New Orleans, and now we're starting the training here in Baltimore on teaching EPIC and teaching bystandership, active bystandership, and teaching the science behind it, but the practice of how to step in front of a colleague, a partner, a supervisor, a commander. When you see your colleague escalating, it does several things, Dave. It prevents injuries to a citizen, it prevents injuries to an officer, and then it saves the officer's career, and it helps build trust within the community. Oftentimes, what we will see is reductions in citizen complaints, but what we will see is now compliments beginning to come in by the citizens saying, hey, I saw Officer A escalating. It looked like he had a bad attitude, but then Officer B stepped in and did a wonderful job. And so instead of getting 2 complaints, what you get is a compliment coming in on how one officer helped do a better job de-escalating another officer and handling the situation. That's what we taught in New Orleans. That's what we're now training in Baltimore. And out of Georgetown University Law Center, they're going to be training the whole country on active bystandership and how to have a good peer intervention program in your department.
Yeah, you can't listen to that concept without thinking about the other 3 officers at the George Floyd confrontation.
Right.
What they might have done.
That was a classic epic moment, and what active bystandership or passive bystandership rather looks like. Active bystandership with training would have had them step in and take over and stop that, and perhaps there could have been a different outcome, but certainly when you now assess what happened to those officers, perhaps there could be some mitigating circumstances about some of the discipline because somebody tried to do the right thing or would have tried to do the right thing.
It's tough in a paramilitary culture to do that, isn't it? It's got to be tough.
Well, it is tough, but I think along with having a good peer intervention program, what we did in New Orleans and now we're doing in Baltimore, and I would admonish any executive who wants to do this, when you build a program like that, it should accompany an anti-retaliation policy, which has strong principles about anti-retaliation and strong discipline for those who retaliate so that officers can feel free to step in and intervene on behalf of another officer, but not be retaliated against and shunned and ostracized because they did so. That is the culture change that we're aiming for right now.
Okay, another question here. Why not more tasers and other non-lethal responses, less shoot to kill training?
I think those are very important. We have tasers, some agencies don't. It all comes down to dollars and cents. And many chiefs would probably advocate to get them, but there is a major cost associated with giving 2,500 cops in Baltimore tasers, or what it was 6,000 plus in Philadelphia tasers. There's an extremely expensive cost. Now, it does prevent serious injury, or is designed rather to prevent serious injury and death. But that's what we call less than lethal. And departments should have more than one less lethal option before going to lethal. But it comes down to dollars and cents and what kind of investment the city and that agency is willing to make to prevent expensive litigation down the road.
Right.
The
Chief Ramsey,
that question, though,
yeah,
police aren't trained to shoot to kill. They're trained to shoot to stop the threat, and they shoot at center mass, which is the largest part of the body. Okay, so it's not shoot to kill. There are people who watch it, that think that you shoot an arm or shoot a leg or whatever, but that's really, you have to be concerned about the background, about who's standing behind them. 2 blocks down the road, do you really want to have some child that's shot because of an errant bullet trying to hit a small target? So I just want to clarify that.
Gotcha. Another questioner says, beyond just reform, people are asking for police reimagined.
Yeah.
Is that a term either of you connect with?
Yeah, first of all, I think there's a couple things, because it's much broader than just that. You first have to figure out what is it that you really want police to do. But I would make it even and put it in a different term, and that is community safety. What does that mean? And when you look at it from a standpoint of community safety, now you're talking about police, you're talking about mental health, you're talking about substance abuse, you're talking about all these different things. And how do they integrate? How do they mesh together to keep a community safe? And so we need to be thinking about it, to me, beyond just reimagining just police. But we've already been talking about all these different important parts of the puzzle. We need to be thinking in terms of community safety. What is, define what that really means, and then what does it take in order to make that a reality, and what agencies need to be involved in that.
Someone else asks, how would you manage that transition period where other types of professionals are being trained and phased in to take on some of the situations that police now handle? Mr. Harrison, this kind of reminds me of your stadium being built next to the Alamo.
First of all, we partner with those professionals who have the capacity to, number one, start training with us, and then start training on how to handle those calls that we currently handle 100% of right now. And as we can deem that they are ready to accept that work, whether on a small scale and then scale it up to a full implementation, we work with those partners to make sure they can handle it. And then what we do, Chuck and I have done this a lot. We are always making an assessment of what are we doing now that we don't need to be doing? And how can we reduce burdens in our organization? And who should be the right person or persons to handle this work? We're always searching for that, every day. I'm doing that every day. And as what we find is that sometimes with mental health, there's not the capacity built yet to handle it. At least in my city, there's not. So we're working to build that capacity and then train our call takers and dispatchers and our officers how to co-respond, and then how to reduce the response and reduce the contact, especially the negative contact, in those kinds of calls. Inevitably, we can come to a decision that perhaps police aren't the best, but somebody else is ready to take it 100% of the way. And if they're not, we can create co-responder models. But it's about planning policy, practice, and planning policy and practice in that order on how we get it done. It's transition. It can't be done overnight. It's transition.
One of our participants says, what police shows do you watch, and which are most true to life? Chief Ramsey, you watch television?
I watch television, but I'll be honest with you, I don't watch cop shows, series and so forth. I mean, when I get off work, the last thing I wanted to do was look at a police show. So like I've never seen the one with Tom Selleck. I forget the name of it now, when he's a police commissioner, whatever the name of it is. But I just, me personally, I just don't watch a whole lot of cop shows.
Yeah. Mr. Harrison, The Wire, the HBO series set in Baltimore. You seen that?
I did, and I was addicted to it. I watched it every episode, every season. But there were many shows that were filmed in New Orleans, and because I worked with them and supervised them, I realized that they're for entertainment. And while there's some truth in it, it's sensationalized. And it's real people, it's real lives that are in those shows. And I knew that. So when I first got to Baltimore, people asked me, "Did you watch The Wire?" My answer was, yes, I did. But you know what? Those are real lives. Those are real people. And while there's some depiction of what was going on inside the Baltimore Police Department, I realized that there are many great people who just want to go to work and do a good job. And TV sensationalizes all of the bad things that were happening. And the reality is, when I first got here, police departments aren't that different. The same things that happen in New Orleans are happening here, and the same documents that hit my desk now were the same documents that hit my desk there in New Orleans. And governing a police department is the same. Though I watch The Wire and I love a good drama like Chuck, I don't watch many police shows. That was one I watched, but it was a long time series. I realized that there are real lives there, and that's not really the true Baltimore and the true essence and the true heart, minds, and souls of the people of Baltimore.
Okay. Another one asks, how can white citizens most effectively support the elimination of bias in the police force and law enforcement generally? Thoughts here? No.
Well, I mean, you eliminate in your own life. I mean, part of the problem is there's bias in society in general. where do we draw our personnel from? We draw from society in general. And so, you know, I think it's incumbent upon all of us, inside, outside of policing, black, white, and it's not just white folks that have bias or racism or whatever. I mean, every group has its own baggage to carry in that regard. We all need to stop prejudging one another. And that even includes the way in which police are being viewed now. I mean, the same people who argue that police profile and stereotype them are the ones that stereotype and profile all cops. And so we all need to stop that and start dealing with people as individuals and stop looking at it through strictly a racial lens or gender lens or what have you.
Commissioner Harrison, you want to add anything there?
Well, I think Chuck's right, but I think we have to train the members of our department, people who are coming into our department, on the cultural history of our city and our cities across the country, and train them on cultural sensitivity. And I think as we do a better job training people in a community policing centric organization about the cultural history and the dynamics and nuances of a city and of a neighborhood, I think we get people, both white and black and otherwise, to understand the demographics and the dynamics of that community and what's really needed. Thus, we have the appropriate approach to dealing with delivering police services. You know, because the members of our department come from our communities, and people bring those biases with them. So we have to really train and teach them about the community they're going to police and work in, and make sure we can, number one, help them understand the need of the people and be sensitive to those needs.
But they also have to be trained on the history of policing in the United States, because the history of policing in the United States is the reason why many of our communities distrust and have bad feelings toward the police, and it's justified. And so we need to be sure that people know why is the attitude in some communities toward police the way it is. And a lot, it has to do with the history of policing. And when you look at the history of policing, police have not always stood on the right side of justice. I mean, and it's just a fact. And these young kids that are coming on now may not have lived during that period of time, have been responsible, but they need to understand it.
Well, I was going to ask if, you know, I've heard some older cops say, you know, we're going to get less profiling, less bias when the new generation comes on, that the new generation has grown up with more interaction with people of different backgrounds. Do you agree?
I think there's maybe some truth to that, but I don't think everybody will be bias free. And we all have bias of some kind. It may not be racial or gender or what have you, but we all have it. The key, as Mike said, with training, understand that you have it. Doesn't make you a racist, you have it. Now, how do you deal with it so that it doesn't influence how you respond and react on the street toward people? And that's really what that kind of training is all about.
All right, here's an issue we've dealt with in Philadelphia, and I know a lot of places have. How do you feel about police living outside the cities and towns that they patrol? The questioner believes this makes it harder to do community policing when officers live in different, perhaps more affluent communities. Mr. Harrison, what's the policy in the two cities you've commanded?
Well, in both cities, officers were allowed to live outside the city. Now think about this, we had a residency in New Orleans, but when Hurricane Katrina destroyed 85% of the city, many of the officers had to find residence outside the city. And so that was tossed out. And many people never moved back. And so many people did not live inside the city. And even in Baltimore, when I got here, going on 2 years ago, only 16% of my department lived inside the city. Now, people will really think that people are more connected to a community that they live in, and perhaps that is true, but it doesn't mean that that person will be a better police officer. You know, in my 30 years, in going to calls and meeting with people, I've never been asked the question of where I live. The only question a citizen has ever asked me is, will you help me?
Chief Ramsey, this is an issue in Philly. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Philly, a few years ago, there was residency, and then through the collective bargaining agreement, that was taken away. They have to live inside of Pennsylvania, but not necessarily the city. Chicago has a residency requirement, or always has. DC does not, Philly doesn't. I agree with Mike. I mean, in a city like Philadelphia, you grow up in the northeast part of Philly or South Philly, and you get assigned to West Philly. I mean, that's not the community you're from. It's really not. And so it's really about a service mentality and your willingness to help people. That really makes for a good police officer. And where you live and where you send your kids to school, really, to me, is not as important as just being a quality individual who's committed to serve those people that they are assigned to in terms of the district that they're assigned to.
Right. Well, a lot of departments are moving in the direction, or were for a while moving in the direction of higher educational requirements.
I
and
agree with that.
And in a city like Philadelphia, where, let's face it, there are a lot of impoverished and struggling communities. Did you find it hard to recruit in the city, Chief Ramsey?
It's not easy to recruit in minority neighborhoods because of a lot of attitudes that people have about police. But I also think we didn't do a good enough a job as good as we could have in terms of actually, putting people in charge of recruiting. We eventually hired someone who is an actual recruiter who could market and who could target certain communities to try to get interest in the department. And I think police have to be more strategic in their recruiting efforts and how they market and really go after certain populations of people in order to be more diverse. And we didn't do a very good job of that. Towards the end of my tenure, we did hire an individual who had experience in that area, but before we really weren't doing that.
So more effort would make a difference there, you think? Yeah.
More effort would make a difference. And again, it's got to be a full-time thing, recruiting. You can't just do it before you're going to give a new exam. I mean, it has to be around, you have to do it all the time and try to get people that are interested in the profession.
Yeah, and Dave, in those cities where chiefs are progressive, I think you even have to take it a step further and build a pipeline into the department, probably starting at the high school level.
Right.
Where you're engaging high school students and you're creating something for them to participate in that allows them, number one, to learn about the culture, learn about the profession, and it keeps them away from bad decisions during the time where they're too young to join. And that period between 18 and 21, perhaps, if we could engage them and keep them occupied and busy and around good cops, then we can create a pipeline from high school to the department for those who perhaps choose not to go to college. When I became the chief in New Orleans, my predecessor had instituted a 60-hour requirement for hire, but it was absolutely killing our recruitment numbers. And having done some research on that, it wasn't producing any better officers. I did away with the college requirement, but I built it back on the back end and made it mandatory for promotions upward in the organization. And so while I didn't make it requirement for hire to get promoted to sergeant, lieutenant, and captain, I built it on that end, and it worked for us. And here in Baltimore, there's no college requirement for hire, but I would like to see it for promotions as well here. That helped us in New Orleans. It helped with recruitment, and it helped with creating better supervisors when it was time to select supervisors.
One of our questioner notes remembers that back in the 1990s, there was this emphasis in cities, particularly on quality of life crimes. You may remember this started in New York with the squeegee guys who would come up and
broken windows.
The broken windows theory, that if you focus on the small things, there's more of a sense of an order. It spreads. Kind of out of vogue now. I don't know. What do the two of you think about that, Chief Ramsey?
I mean, listen, when you go to community meetings, people aren't there talking about what we call part one offenses. Most of what they're talking about is quality of life, and we have to find a way to address it. But everything shouldn't result in an arrest. And so there's got to be ways in which we can deal with some of these quality of life issues short of making it a policing action only. I mean, we've got to be able to find other ways of handling it, because again, I think some of that is how we wound up in a situation where we get alienated from our communities. Because let's face it, your more challenged communities are the ones that have the highest number of quality of life issues occurring all the time, And so, you're gonna have more contact, and a lot of it's not gonna be very positive contact.
Yeah, I mean, Commissioner Harrison, and people in business communities get concerned when there's a lot of panhandling, a lot of visible homeless folks on the street. And of course, a lot of people say, look, there's poverty out there. You can't criminalize homelessness.
Yeah, look, we absolutely have that dynamic in Baltimore with panhandling, with squeegee kids, as they're called. We absolutely have that, and we deal with it every day. Now, look, academically, broken windows theory, was about dealing with those small things, but it was never supposed to be enforcement only. It was about correcting the social ills
Right.
that are small things. And it has been translated over time to enforce on the small thing, which is not what I believe in. And I do believe that, and that's what this new coming mayor and our administration are going to be focusing on, really addressing the social ills that lead to these quality of life nuances in our city. And by giving people a pathway away and putting them on a different track to do something different and productive where they can earn a living and have a better quality of life is the way to do it, not necessarily in having enforcement on those small things so that they don't become big things.
A couple of questions about, I guess, training and hiring here. What do you think of behavioral assessments of officers during hiring and training so that you can select for candidates with the guardian rather than warrior mentality? Thoughts here?
Yeah, that's absolutely necessary. Any real good police department's already doing that. Most police departments that are under some kind of civil service are probably mandated to do that.
How do you do it? How do you do it, Commissioner?
Well, we have a psychologist that either works for us or his own retainer to do those psychological assessments of every candidate at two stages, at the early stage of the recruiting and before we actually do a formal hire. And then throughout the training, perhaps there's another stage. But most good police departments are police departments that work under some civil service will have some police psychologist to do those assessments of the candidates to make sure that the people have the right temperament. And see, skill set is one thing, temperament is something different. You have to have the right temperament also to be a police department, to be a police officer. And then in certain types of communities, that temperament becomes extremely important because we're moving away from warrior more into guardian because for example, we're turning our department into a community policing centric department and away from the bad boy, rough and tough image kind of police officer. It's really about building relationships and building trust.
The other part of that too, with the psychological screening is for resilience, so that because officers are exposed to a lot of trauma and things of that nature. So resilience. The other thing, and you mentioned training in that question, one area that's truly lacking in policing is leadership development. And, good leaders like Mike Harrison are more by accident than by design. And that's unfortunate. We need to really develop leadership for the next generation of police leaders. We actually, when I was president of Major City Chiefs, started a Police Executive Leadership Institute, and 2 faculty members from Penn are actually a part of it, Candy Weens and Annie McKee, and they're part of the faculty. So leadership development, getting people ready to assume these top leadership positions is very, very important. And that could be part of that national, when you talked about what they could do nationally, they could actually create command colleges and do other things to really help develop leadership.
Commissioner Harrison, let me just come back to you a moment when you were saying that you're working now on giving police a different attitude, making them focus on building trust rather than being tough. How are the troops responding?
Well, they respond well, and I think it's something different. For example, when I go on these community walks with neighborhoods and neighborhood leaders and police officers, we're walking through the community. I'm off to the side, knocking on doors, shaking hands, and when I see people, I stop and I walk towards them to speak to them and talk to them. And I see many of the officers are just continuing to walk. Many of our politicians just continue to walk. And they never realize, or they don't realize, that the purpose of the walk is to engage the people, not just to take a walk. And so I'm off by myself talking to people and hugging on kids, and I'm looking back and all the politicians and all the cops are just still walking down the street. I think it takes some reconditioning and unlearning. We have to unlearn these bad practices and then reteach the appropriate way to do that. And then show them the goodwill and how citizens respond to that kind of engagement, and put that kind of smile on their faces. When cops see that, they'll replicate that and want to do that more often. So, that's what I'm trying to do. And to get them out of this concept of, I'm here to catch bad guys. Too often not. I believe Chuck probably will say this. When I got hired in 1991, everybody would say, I'm joining so I could go catch bad guys. How about we're hired so that we can go serve the citizens, and so that we can protect the innocent from those who wish to do harm, and that we can make a difference in somebody's life, not just catch bad guys. That will happen, but we're really here to serve and protect people. And we really have to condition our people away from that old mentality into this new way of thinking.
Right.
Let me finish with one big question here. Do you agree that the fundamental issue is not just police attitudes, but systemic racism in a host of government institutions? Chief Ramsey?
What a problem. I mean, there's systemic racism again throughout society. I mean, it's not limited to police. It does exist, but I think a lot of it is just bias. We talked about implicit bias, and I think that is what I have seen more often than not. I've experienced real racism internally. When I joined Chicago PD in 1968. That was a different era, believe me. And I mean, black cops only worked black areas, and the only sergeants you saw were in their 50s or 60s. You couldn't even make it in terms of promotions and so forth. So I've actually seen that sort of thing in action. What I see more often now, and there is some systemic racism throughout the criminal justice system, which is why it needs to be examined. But not every action is really based on just a racist attitude. Implicit bias, I think, is a very, very big problem that we have to confront. But it's not limited to police, and people keep act as if police are the only ones that have these issues, and that's,
Well, I think
no, that's not the case.
Yeah, I think the questioner is saying a lot of government institutions. I mean, housing policy.
Not just government institutions.
Correct.
I mean,
Okay.
it's
Right.
Yeah, but yeah, does it exist? Yeah, it exists.
Commissioner Harrison?
Yeah, I agree. It exists, but it's like Chuck said, it's not just limited to police. I've experienced it, over the course of my 30 years, and it does exist in police departments and other law enforcement agencies. But it's really a bigger issue of society and how all of us think, and the biases, implicit biases that we have. And so I think people want to narrow it down to just police, but it is society in general that's the issue. And we as a people, we as a society have to really deal with it and tackle it and overcome this in order for that correction to manifest itself inside of one particular agency, if that makes sense.
The other thing too, Dave, real quick, if you when you're talking about changing behavior, changing attitudes, if you start off with a training where you accuse everybody of being racist, they're going to shut down and they're not going to listen. They're not going to hear anything past that. And that's why I think we have to be very careful and not throw that around too much. It doesn't mean that you're denying that it exists. But if we really want to change behavior, if we want to change the way we think and interact with one another, we have to have an approach that really doesn't put people on defensive right away.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, Chief Ramsey and Commissioner Harrison, and I wish you luck. It's very important work. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you to all of you who participated and submitted these great questions. And I think I'll throw it back to Leah Anderson for a final thought. Leah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Davies and Commissioners Harrison and Ramsey for sharing from your rich experiences and expertise and making those contributions to our ongoing dialogue. And thank you to our audience for an overwhelming and really engaged number of questions. We appreciate that. We'll have a video recording available of this event, and it will be posted on the SNF-Padilla website in the coming weeks. So check back, and you can share this event with family and friends who are not able to be here tonight. Just a reminder that members of the Penn community can sign up with the link sent in the chat to participate in an ongoing follow-up dialogue from this event with the student organization Table Talk. Also, as you can see on the screen, we want to invite you to a couple of other SNF Padilla events next week. Also on pressing relevant issues that we're facing in our region and in our country. Next week on December 8th, will be part of an ongoing series on racism and anti-racism in contemporary America. And the focus of next week will be the public health system, health and awareness disparities. And then on the 10th, the Andrea Mitchell Center is sponsoring a talk on internet speech and democratic politics. And again, SNF Padilla is joining with Table Talk to sponsor a post-event dialogue. You can find out more information and the registration links on the SNF Padilla website on the screen. So let me close by again thanking our sponsors, the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice, the Committee of 70, and the Sunday Breakfast Club, and of course the Gamba family for funding this event. On behalf of the Red and Blue Exchange and the SNF Padilla program, I wish you a good evening. Thank you.